Okay. I'd like to thank Dr. Ina for joining us for this discussion, and I'd like to thank my friends Nadia, Iga, and Willem for helping to organize it. So I just have a really quick statement to provide some background information on our conversation with Dr. Ina tonight, and then we will jump into some questions and then a Q&A portion. So today's discussion was prompted by two related questions. What does the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II tell us about the present moment, and how does it intersect with the struggles for immigrant rights and racial equality? Under the Trump administration, we have witnessed a flood of racist and restrictive immigration policies, from the border wall to family separation to the expansion of ICE, the use of new surveillance technologies and mass deportations. Trump has explicitly referred to immigrants as animals, and now we have immigrants in cages just like animals. Many of the invasive technologies used at the border on immigrants are also used to police those of us inside the country. The history of Japanese American incarceration can remind us of what happens when racism drives our response to immigration and national security. The dispossession and detention of nearly 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, both citizens and non-citizens alike, is a stain on US history. And yet, we are seeing many of the same narratives and policies being used to control and patrol immigrants today. Perhaps the starkest example of these layered histories is Fort Sill, a military base outside Oklahoma City, which was first used as a POW camp for members of the Apache tribe at the turn of the 20th century, then turned into a concentration camp for hundreds of Japanese Americans during World War II, and was used most recently as a detention facility for migrant children from Central America in 2014. Laws that dehumanize immigrants have real life and often deadly consequences. They are informed and connected by overlapping histories of racism. The detention of Japanese Americans during World War II and the detention of immigrants today are seen as justifiable because immigrants have always been viewed with suspicion as potential threats. Immigrants who are not racialized as white are often placed in the category of the perpetual foreigner who is either unable or unwilling to assimilate. This notion of assimilation is based, however, on the myth that the US has always been white. It ignores the fact that the country was in fact founded on the enslavement and genocide of non-white peoples. So tonight's discussion will illuminate the related struggles against racism, surveillance, and incarceration viewed within the context of immigration and citizenship, past and present. I first met Dr. Ina last year at a conference on authoritarianism held at my alma mater. I'm the grandchild of a Japanese immigrant who came to the US after World War II as a war bride, so I was interested to learn more about the stories and experiences of Japanese Americans who were directly impacted by incarceration. So we invite everyone now to join us in this conversation. There will be a Q&A portion at the end of the event, so please share with us your thoughts and questions. So now, before I stop talking, I'm going to formally introduce Dr. Satsuki Ina. So Satsuki Ina is a truly remarkable person. She's a writer, activist, scholar, psychotherapist, and filmmaker who has spent her professional career examining the long-term impact of collective and historical trauma. She was born in the Tule Lake Segregation Center, a maximum security US concentration camp for Japanese Americans during World War II. She is Professor Emeritus at California State University, Sacramento, and provides consultation to communities and organizations on collective and intergenerational trauma. Dr. Ina is also co-chair of Tsuru for Solidarity, a grassroots coalition formed in response to racist and violent immigration policies. She has produced 2 award-winning documentary films, Children of the Camps and From a Silk Cocoon. And this year, Satsuki Ina was also featured in the PBS documentary series, Asian Americans. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Ina, who I think will share with us a video from Democracy Now! And talk a little bit about what life was like growing up in a US concentration camp for Japanese Americans and what her current work looks like today in the fight against immigration detention. So the floor is yours, the Zoom floor.
Thank you for this opportunity to share with you the work that we've been doing through Tsuru for Solidarity. I thought since you did a good and thorough introduction of myself that showing this 10-minute portion of this video might help people just get some background and context about the work that we're doing today. So let me see if I could get this to be full screen there. Okay, so let me get this back.
This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to a dramatic scene that unfolded Saturday when 5 Japanese American elders, survivors of the U.S. internment camps, engaged in civil disobedience outside the Fort Sill Army Post in Oklahoma, where the Trump administration plans to indefinitely detain 1,400 immigrant and refugee children starting next month. Fort Sill was an internment camp for 700 Japanese American men in 1942. It was one of more than 70 sites where the U.S. government incarcerated about 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II, including one of 14 U.S. Army bases. President Obama first used Fort Sill in 2014 to detain migrant children seeking asylum from violence in Central America. Last December, Jake Lincall, a 7-year-old Guatemalan girl, became one of 6 children to die in Border Patrol custody in less than a year after she was held in a Customs and Border Patrol facility near the site of another former U.S. internment camp in Lordsburg, New Mexico. Well, Democracy Now! Was there in Fort Sill, Oklahoma on Saturday when the Japanese American elders incarcerated in these camps risked arrest to protest along with descendants of survivors.
Well,
my name is Satsuki Ina. I'm a former child incarceree during World War II. This is a photograph of me when I was imprisoned. 75 years ago, 120,000 of us were removed from our homes and forcefully incarcerated in prison camps across the country. We're here today to protest the repetition of history. We were in American concentration camps. We were held under indefinite detention. We were without due process of law. We were charged without any evidence of being a threat to national security, that we were an unassimilable race, that we would be a threat to the economy. We hear these exact words today regarding innocent people seeking asylum in this country. And unlike 1942, when America turned our back on us while we were disappearing from our homes, our schools, our farms, and our jobs. We're here today to speak out, to protest the unjust incarceration of innocent people seeking refuge in this country. We stand with them, and we are saying, stop repeating history.
My name is Kiyoshi Ina. I'm from Concord, California, and I spent the first 4.5 years in a concentration camp. I was born in Topaz, Utah, and I'm here to protest against the incarceration of the immigrant children here at Fort Sill.
I'm Nikki Nojima Lewis, and on December 7th, 1941, in Seattle, Washington, I was celebrating my 4th birthday when the FBI interrupted my birthday party and removed my father to Lordsburg, New Mexico, the DOJ camp, and subsequently Santa Fe, New Mexico. My mother and I were incarcerated at the Puyallup Fairgrounds called Camp Harmony, and later in Minidoka, Idaho.
You cannot protest on Fort Sill. If you want to protest, you have to go across the street, the highway, and that needs to happen right now. Let's go, let's go, let's go, now, today.
My name is Omari.
No, you may not. Again, I will say it, this is the last time. You cannot protest on Fort Sill. You need to move across the street now.
Tsuru, were you going to make a statement?
Yes.
Apparently you didn't hear what I said.
I'm sorry, sir.
You need to move today, now, right now. Move.
Otherwise, what will happen?
I don't know. No, I'm not going to arrest you, but you need to move now.
Then we're not going to move.
Yes, you're going to move.
If you're not going to arrest us, we're not going to move.
Go ahead.
Okay, yes. I spent 3.5 years at Poston, Arizona, an American concentration camp during World War II, and I'm here to bear witness to the travesty of the American justice system, in that the family separation policy, which is ruining the lives of these children. I'm very incensed about the government policy of separating parents, and we the people have to stand up and protest this.
My name's Tom Ikeda. I'm the executive director of Detention. It's a nonprofit in Seattle. And one of the things that Detention does is we're the story keepers for the community, especially what happened during World War II. And so I came here to honor the story of Saburo Oshima, who was shot and killed here. 9 years ago, I interviewed his son in Kona, Hawaii. And he told me how this man with 11 children and businesses in Kona was taken for no crime and brought here. And the trauma of being here, the stress, he ended up essentially, as the son said, snapped. And he started climbing the fence in broad daylight saying, I want to go home. And as the other internees said, don't shoot, a guard came up and shot him on the back of his head and killed him. And so in his honor, I'm here to remember Saburo Oshima.
My name is Paul Tomita. I'm from Seattle, Washington. This is me in 1943. As a 4-year-old.
Yeah. It's English. Get out.
And so what we did with here is I had to have this to get out of
Look. I understand your issues, okay? But you cannot protest on Fort Sill.
All of our elders who are incarceration survivors have stated publicly that they are willing to be arrested in defense of the children who are going to be brought here.
Satsuki, can you please describe what's happening now?
They're wanting to remove us. We've been removed too many times. If that's what it comes to,
People understand.
we will stay here and
What don't you people understand?
Understand the whole history of this country, and we aren't going to let it happen again. What were you saying, Satsuki?
that we want to make a stand. We want to say that we are protesting the fact that 1,400 children are going to be brought to this military site. We're here because we do not want to have that happen. And as former children of prison camps, of concentration camps in America, we are saying no more, never again.
That was the scene at Fort Sill Army Post in Oklahoma Saturday, where Japanese American survivors of U.S. internment camps, which they called concentration camps, risked arrest Saturday to protest the detention of migrant children.
Okay.
Wow.
Let's see if I can get it back on the screen.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Dr. Ina. That was really powerful. And I was going to ask you actually about your Fort Sill action, but it was presented, I think, in sharp relief through that video. Can you talk a little bit more about that experience and kind of why you felt compelled to get involved in the struggle against immigration detention? You could just imagine, you know, with the way that one guard was treating the protesters there, how they would have treated the migrant children if they were in fact sent by the Trump administration, which luckily did not happen, though it was only because they ended up saying there weren't enough children, I think, to put in detention at Fort Sill. But can you describe a bit more about that situation and what led you to take this kind of activist position?
Sure. Can't get you back on the full screen. That's all right.
Oh.
You can see me okay, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe if I stop screen share. There, okay. I think, so how it all started was In 2015, at the end of the Obama administration, a young fourth-generation Japanese-American attorney for ACLU, he was with the National Prisons Project, called me and asked if I would come to South Texas and enter the prison facility there, holding women and children, and that I would go undercover as a religious visitor with the church group because they didn't let professionals inside. And ACLU wanted a psychologist to make an evaluation of the trauma that the children are being victimized by. And they couldn't get in to get the information. So I thought it was, and he was very distressed by what was happening because his grandparents had been held in the Tule Lake Segregation Center, the prison camp where I was born. So he was particularly distressed. And he said that when the Carnes Family Residential Center, more euphemistic language, was opened, they allowed ACLU to come in and look at the beautiful new facilities that your tax dollar paid for. And they proudly opened up the supply cabinet, and what he saw was so distressing to him. It was rows and rows of little shoes. And it was so, in anticipation of the arrival of these children, he actually broke down when he was describing it to me. And so I said, yes, I will come. I don't speak Spanish. He said, don't worry, we have someone that will be with you. The priest will do the translation, but you have to pretend like you're not being translated for, otherwise you wouldn't be qualified as a visitor. So, what I observed was very disturbing. I wrote an article, Huffington Post picked it up and described the interviews I had with these mothers and children and observations of the children who were extremely traumatized, being held in the arms of traumatized mothers. And, I specialize in trauma with children, so I know that the lasting effects of developing brains that are exposed to this level of threat every day can actually alter the physiology of the brain and having huge impact on the way the child will later on process threat to themselves, suffering typically extreme cases of anxiety and depression. So then I went back several times and participated in hearings to make the prison system there was trying to be certified as a child development center in order to evade the Flores settlement that required that children be held in the least restrictive environment for no more than 20 days. And in order to get around that, if they qualified as a child development center, they could avoid Flores. And then I went back several times more for protests and marches that were being organized by Latinx communities in that South Texas area. And at one of these protests, demonstrations, they asked me to say a few words. I was the only Japanese American there at the time. And as I was speaking, it dawned on me that not far from that very site, at the Dilley Family Residential Center prison, was where I had been held, separated from my father, left with my mother and my brother. We were about to be deported. And as I said that, I hadn't consciously thought that through, but as I was speaking, it dawned on me that it was somewhere near there. And afterwards, the grassroots leadership camera guy came over and said, you want to go to Crystal City, Texas, where you were held right now? And I said, yes. So we got in the car and drove over there, and he filmed the site. And then I talked about my family being there. So in March of 2019, there's a small group of us that were children at Crystal City, Texas, organizing a pilgrimage. We wanted to go back there and see the site of shame where we were held, waiting for our fathers to be reunited with us so we could be deported to Japan. And keeping in mind that my parents were American citizens, and of course I had never been to Japan. Then several people joined us, and it was like, we couldn't ignore the fact that the family residential center was just 40 miles east of where we were having our pilgrimage. And so 60 of us who were planning this pilgrimage said, okay, let's bring some paper cranes. Because I said, you know, the fence is far away from where the children are being held. And we want them to know that somebody outside cared, that somebody was protesting and standing with them and working to not only bring out the injustice, but actually to work towards abolishing these incarceration sites. And so we asked our family members and other people in the community to fold paper cranes, because in Japanese culture, paper cranes represent peace and compassion. And we had hoped to get 1,000 cranes that we would hang on the fence. And by the time we arrived, we were working with grassroots leadership. By the time we got to Texas to hang the cranes, we had gathered 30,000 paper cranes that we then hung on the fence. And we wanted the children to hear us. So I reached out to taiko drummers in various areas, and 2 groups came, one from New York and one from Denver, because we wanted the drums representing our heartbeats to be heard by the children inside of that prison. And then the wonderful thing that happened is Telemundo, the Spanish-speaking TV station, showed up to get the story, and the ACLU attorneys had been notified by grassroots leadership that we were going to be protesting at 2:00 in the afternoon to listen for the drums. But with Telemundo actually live broadcasting at the time, the children and the mothers were able to watch the event from inside the prison. And so we had this small agenda that has grown from there to actually being a movement, particularly in our own community, and expanding our vision to just looking at the carceral state that the US government has supported and expanded over the years.
Thank you so much for that. That's a really powerful story. I did not know all the details. And so I guess that then developed into Tsuru for solidarity. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't speak Japanese, but Tsuru means crane, does it? Okay.
Yes, it means, yeah, it refers to the paper cranes.
Yeah, yeah. And that's, I think it's such a beautiful image. So I guess really quickly, we'll move on to the 4 questions that the co-hosts have prepared so that we have more time for the rest of the audience to join in and ask questions or just engage in a discussion with their own thoughts. So Nadia, would you like to go first, or does anyone have their question ready? Anyone want to take a, okay.
Hi, yeah, I can go first. Hi, Dr. Ina again. Thank you for taking this time to speak with all of us. So my question is, like, what concepts of solidarity and liberation do you mean in, like, how does that work in theory and how does it work in practice?
You know, I think for me, this whole idea of liberation and solidarity has been, has emerged, my understanding of it has emerged really from this grassroots action. I'm not a theorist on the subject matter, you know, I'm basically a psychologist, but I think the idea, when we take the psychology of incarceration and confinement and injustice, that the systems have been used as racist implementation of racist policies to maintain white supremacy. And so you know, psychologists look for internal motivation, but my work has shifted my focus away to broader and broader spaces to look at how we have, for example, as a society, internalized the whole idea that prisons are something you gotta have, that prisons are something that is the punishment for bad behavior. And, you know, my work as an activist has shown me that the resources need to go to the victims, and instead of millions, billions of dollars going into building these prison sites, we have taken money away from services and programs that could be improving our society by centering victims who have been victimized, and developing advanced social systems and programs, community-based programs, to get to the core of the problem. Why, for example, just not just the immigrants that are seeking asylum, but if you look at that, why are they coming to the U.S. is because there is so much disruption and so much criminalization of innocent people as they arrive here. Innocent people being treated as criminals. They haven't committed a single crime. And what do we do with that problem of people of color? We incarcerate them rather than looking to what brought them here. How did we participate in that international exchange that led to people fleeing their country for their own safety? So, you know, going from my private practice working with individual children and seeing the repetition of the themes and the problems, parents who struggle with poverty, who are targeted by our justice system, and then the long-term consequences of these children growing up without parents, and things like that, that really has moved me away from doing individual work and being more engaged at the level of social change.
I think that's really quickly just to say on that. I
Being
think
on mute.
that's so fabulous. And like in the immigration discourse, we often don't take enough time to think about why people are coming here in the first place. And I think, as the great abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore has noted, it is neoliberal policies, the latest iteration of racial capitalism, which has destabilized the entire world. As more and more countries adopt neoliberal policies and policies of austerity, we see, you know, greater and greater numbers of prisons being built in those countries. Russia, I think, is right behind the US right now. And ever since they adopted, you know, neoliberal policies, they've resorted to incarceration as the solution or the response to social problems, you know. So we have to look at the broader picture. And I think at this point, a lot of us realize that incarceration, policing, detention, it is not the way to go. It's killing people, it's harming people, it's not helping society. But I'm sorry, I think that was just a really important point that you made, and I just wanted to kind of amplify that. But Iga or Willem, anyone want to go next?
I can go ahead because it segues into my question pretty well. You know, I was wondering, you know, I feel oftentimes in, you know, whether it was in high school or even in college, there's this narrative that is repeated that, you know, internment camps, concentration camps, were these horrendous institutions that only existed during World War II or the 20th century, and it kind of left that behind, when in fact, like, we see the state continually repeating these same mechanisms just under new names and new forms. And so I was wondering, you know, how does the experience of, you know, Japanese American internment, how does your experience, for example, resonate with the ongoing movement for prison abolition, for abolishing detention centers overall, and how do you feel we'll get there? You know, how can we get towards a space where everyone is on board, you know, behind abolishing these institutions?
Yeah, thank you, Iga. You know, I think the attempt to reform our prison system hasn't worked. And that really the only answer is abolition. That we have to reshape our whole thinking about how we keep people safe, how we take care of each other, how does communities grow, how do we have equity, all of these kinds of broad issues, rather than punishment in prisons. And I think efforts over the last several decades to make, you know, modest changes requiring certain kinds of regulations for police to regulate themselves, things like that just haven't worked. And that we need to make a space for creative redesign of society in a way that doesn't punish, but actually heals and educates people. And, you know, Japanese American incarceration is a great example of how racism, how incarceration is a tool for racism. I mean, we hadn't committed a crime. The only justification is if we had 1/4 Japanese blood. And so that meant that babies in orphanages who had 1/4 Japanese blood were removed from foster care and orphanages and placed in an orphanage inside the prison camp in Manzanar, and described as threats to national security. That was the justification for incarceration. And that's the same justification that's being used today. This is for the broader social security, social protection. And actually what it has been is a front for maintaining white supremacy. And until we have a dramatic overhaul of our social justice system, I think it will continue, and it has. You know, this is 75 years ago when I was born in a prison camp. And today there are babies being born in prison camps. So nothing has really changed. It's gotten worse.
Thank you, Dr. Ina.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask about, from your own journey, seeking to understand the trauma passed down from those incarcerated in Japanese internment camps, what has surprised you in how trauma crosses over intergenerationally? And if you could talk more about what this means for trauma to cross over intergenerationally.
Okay, it's a great question. One thing I want to ask is, you know, we have really struggled against the kind of dismissive narrative that the government has promoted about what happened to Japanese Americans. And one way they did that is to use euphemistic language. You know, they called it evacuation, they called it relocation, they didn't call it arrest and mass incarceration. So reference to what happened to the Japanese Americans is not internment camps. They are concentration camps or prison camps. And we're really trying to correct that, because internment camps are legal. They're by international law, enemy aliens can be placed into internment camps. But we weren't enemy aliens. We were, 2/3 of us were American citizens. So when you refer to the Japanese American experience, it's easy to say internment camp because that's the word that's been used so commonly. But I think it's good to check that. And we want to label things that describe what was true. So I've been very interested in intergenerational transmission of trauma. And from an activist point of view, what I've found too is that when we do our Tsuru for Solidarity is doing a series of educational programs, and we do part of our mission in addition to working for social change, we see it important to do our own healing. And what I've learned from the 4th generation, these are children, you know, these are people who are adults that would be my children's age, have an experience of feeling like they were traumatized even though they weren't there. And they want to understand what that was about. There's lots of research that's being done. There's even effort to try and link some kind of change in the genetic system, not necessarily the DNA, but the messaging. That when someone experiences trauma, there are changes to the brain and could be transmission genetically by some triggering mechanism that heightens the potential for anxiety and depression in the person. But until that gets confirmed, we're going to stay with what we know, which is that if you think about parents that are holding children in their arms while they themselves are fearful for their own lives or don't know how long they're going to be incarcerated, which is a form of torture, then children's view of the world is significantly impacted by how they're held, what they see on the parents' faces, and then later on messages from the parents, and then messages when they get to school from other people outside. And the message that gets reinforced is that you're not valued, you're not important, you have to be quiet, you have to avoid conflict, you're not to speak out, you're not to cause any trouble. And what happened for the Japanese Americans is really an important lesson in understanding how racism works. So we were identified as the model minority. And that meant that it was a measure of our proximity to whiteness. The more we were like the white people, the more acceptable we could become. And then we were used to contrast that with darker skinned people. And so people like my parents, who are still on survival mode after they were released because they didn't know at what point they could be re-incarcerated. If there's no reason and no cause, some random thing could happen, like the president refers to the COVID-19 as the Chinese flu, and people immediately start seeing the Asian people as threats. So it could turn on a dime. And so in order to survive, people like my parents really bought into the idea that their next generation of children would be the model minority. And as a therapist in private practice, I could tell you that most of the Japanese American young kids, young people that I've seen, came to see me because they were so full of anxiety and stress that they couldn't be as perfect as their parents wanted them to. They wouldn't be the doctors and the lawyers. Instead, they might have to be, a dentist instead of a doctor, or somehow didn't meet the level of safety by their occupation. They had a clean record. If anything, in any way they stepped off the mark, wasn't just you're not doing well, it was you are putting us at risk. So that level of mostly unspoken anxiety lived in our homes, passed on to us. And along with that was the shame of having been incarcerated, even when you're innocent, to live in that degraded kind of situation, and the narrative that said that we were, like Trump has described the immigrants seeking asylum here as, rapists and criminals. We were described as saboteurs and terrorists. So then you go out in society as a kid and you get this kind of feedback about your worth in the country. And then you have children. And there's a compensatory response to that, like, what do I need to do now? So one of the things that happened to the Japanese Americans is we outmarried like crazy. We have the highest outmarriage rate of any other ethnic minority post World War II. So my generation typically married outside of the Japanese community and moved towards whiteness that way. And in that process, we lost our language prematurely. We've lost our culture. We've lost our connection with our country of origin. And many of the people my age will say they hated being Japanese growing up. So those are the things that gets conveyed to the child. I think it's emotional, it can be unspoken, and it's inside of them from the level of anxiety, just not feeling safe. Then in their relationship to their parents, what's the message the parents giving to them? And then what messages do they get outside, teachers, peers, things like that. It shapes how they view the world and how they view themselves. And then that gets transmitted to the next generation.
Thank you for that. I do have to say, I know we've talked about this, but my mom kind of went through a similar phenomenon. I mean, her mom was an immigrant who came after World War II, but there was still, of course, a lot of anti-Asian, a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. My mom grew up in a very small town and like the coal region of Pennsylvania, so very, very white. And, you know, for many years, she would always identify herself as white on documents and so on. And then one day I asked her, like, why do you identify more with like your father and your white heritage when you were actually so much closer to your mom, who was a Japanese immigrant? I mean, you're half Japanese, but why do you tell people that you're white or check mark, you know, the white on, you know, the check mark the white box on forms? And she couldn't really answer. I think a lot of it was just this internalization of shame, which is, you know, a product of white supremacy and living in a country that degrades and demeans, you know, certain kinds of people, right? But I guess I will finish up then with my question, which kind of tags on to the Asian American identity and how that has shaped your activism, and then we will take some of the questions in the audience. So my question is, how has your identity played a role in your career and community organizing? How do you think Asian American activism has evolved over the decades since you have been involved? And what do you see as the most pressing issues today? And I guess then on top of that too, why is it important to you that the US never forgets the story of Japanese American incarceration during World War II?
So you guys are very tricky because you made me think you were going to ask 4 questions, but actually it's 4 times 8. So I'll do my best. You know, I think that the issue of identity is something that my parents were very ambivalent about because they raised me to survive. They didn't raise me to be Japanese American because being Japanese American wasn't enough to be accepted. So I grew up wishing that I was white until, I would say until the civil rights movement. And, you know, I think Black activists were inspirations for many of us who were in college at that time. But still, we hadn't put the pieces together about, many of us didn't even know what our prison camp experience was about because our parents were so traumatized, they never spoke about it. It like any other kind of trauma, they compartmentalize that experience and in addition to that, deliberately avoided talking about it, not to burden us, not to re-experience the shame and the trauma. So this ambivalence about who I am was not an overt conflict for me, but more, you know, the more white I am, the more white I behave, the better my life would be, was the message that I got. So I think the human rights movement, I was at Berkeley, at Cal during the civil rights movement and the beginning of change. And ethnic studies was instituted, and finally there was some information about who we were and what our history was. And that had a huge impact on me. I did my doctoral dissertation on developing cultural competence in therapists. because all the theories that I had been trained in to understand human psychology was all based on white middle class European understanding of what was good mental health. I think that retelling our story as Japanese Americans and keeping that story alive is important. It's important at two levels. One is for ourselves as a community. It's part of our identity that we suffered that. And to write that story, because the government narrative is what prevailed for most of our lives. The government distorted the reality of our confinement. And just as they're distorting it today, what they're doing to those children and mothers in these detention facilities and what they're doing to people inside of prisons. The story that they're not at risk for COVID. I mean, it's so contemporary still today. So bringing our story from history into today is important for education and for our own healing, that our story and our lives impacted by this history is important to be a part of American history. We have to own our history in order to right the ship. And we can't let this story be suppressed because it had been suppressed for so long. So the more stories we have, the more potential for change. I think the more possibility to get people outraged, upset about what has happened, discovering the truth, speaking the truth. And that's what the uprisings are about today. It's like really gathering together to speak the truth. And for us Japanese Americans, we have found how important it is to be in solidarity with other communities of color as we move forward, and with white allies, people who respect the history and find a way to support the voices of people who are speaking out today. I'm really moved by what's happening, and you know, we had to take to the streets. We had to go and with that bully military police guy that you just saw on that video, you know, we had to stand up and speak out and not be cowed or pushed around in a way that violates our humanity.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. And now let's open up the forum. So I think Enes, you have the first question, if you want to go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Ina. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. What I'll ask will be similar to what I said to you when you came to Syracuse regarding the fight for Asian American like loyalty between, you know, conservatives, you know, Trumpists, and, you know, leftists. But before I get to that, I want to make a comment on the significance behind the detention centers at the border where, you know, even children are being detained, taken away from their parents. That is sometimes missed by my American friends. America is going through a demographic transition that no other country went through. And it's a transition that will make, in essence, no single demographic to be a clear majority. And this causes security anxiety in a way that Americans had security anxiety vis-a-vis Japanese Americans in World War II. Some Americans, mostly white Americans, but not exclusively, have security anxiety over seeing their demographic kind of dwindling away, and they extrapolate from this, you know, white genocide, etc., etc. It's really important for the rest of the world, where such changes will happen later on, that America goes through with change in a way that's stable and that's dignified for all people involved. And like I come from a country, I'm from Turkey, where there is an ethnic and religious minorities that's roughly 20%. So 70% of the population is on the majority of both, but the trends are changing. So in the upcoming decades, and as the majority's demographic gets lower and lower ratio-wise, there is a political pressure from them. That's almost like a reflex to push back against the rising, or as they see as the rising populations. And when they feel the stakes are high, they start justifying the most inhumane acts. So that's a dynamic that's sometimes missed. So what I want, so one person that spearheads this anti-immigrant, any kind of immigrant, honestly, not only illegal but also legal, is an Asian American. Her name is Michelle Malkin, and I wasn't surprised to discover a couple of days ago that she got her writing career started as wrote a book that argued in favor of the internment camps. I'm sure you're familiar, and she was scorned by the Japanese American Citizens League. I saw like a 2004 dated writing by the Japanese American Citizens League against her book. She's a Philippine American, and she thinks that migration of any sort, as this trend continues, will be the death of America as they know it. And I am curious where I don't like to boil down Asian Americans into this like one large group, because there's so much difference within it. But I am curious of the relationship right now between Asian Americans, whiteness, white supremacy, and some contemporary like struggles going through these camps, because presumably the relationship between white supremacy, between Asian Americans, is not as clear cut as the relationship between white supremacy and Black Americans. Just looking for some comments, to be honest.
Yeah. So part of the overall, I'm sure everyone knows this and understands this, that part of the power structure's investment in maintaining their dominance is to get us to turn against each other. And that has worked well in the Asian American community. Fewer resources, people competing, and historic complications. So, for example, Michelle Malkin is an extreme conservative and wrote a book that denied my history. The whole idea that that people were justified in incarcerating us. And people wondered, because of her Filipino background, and Japanese in Japan had invaded and captured, occupied the Philippines, and were quite brutal there, that there was this antipathy that she inherited or learned, or was as a basis for her view. It's pretty amazing to me that someone could write a book and that it would be published based on factoids that are lies in the face of hundreds of people testifying about what happened to them. But this is the kind of thing that has fed, and I think it brings us to, there's a lot of conservatism in the Japanese American community, because their survival was based on not being Black, not being dark, and more acceptable to American society. And for survival reasons, I think about how, you know, my parents would say something like, you know, we don't want you to marry a Chinese person, but it's okay if you marry a white person, as long as they're middle class and above. So there's historical conflict, and then I think the internal US conflict that has been fed by government narrative and manipulation that have turned us against each other. So it is something that we are working towards. Our own healing is to be able to, so we do these healing circles after every one of our actions. And we're doing these cross-community healing circles so that we, instead of showing up at a protest and shouting and then partying, we gather together in circles and we facilitate the opportunity for people to hear each other's stories across communities. And that has been very powerfully healing. To hear a Chinese person's story that goes against the stereotypes that we learned from our own family about who Chinese people are. I could say that many of us across, within the Asian community, across communities, pretty unified in seeing Michelle Malkin as a puppet for the white narrative. So she helped us. She helped bring us together.
And I'll just say too, she wrote that book in defense of internment on the heels of 9/11. So it was really a book that was supposed to generate support for a lot of these proposals that were out there to register Muslim Americans, to put Muslim Americans in camps or in detention centers like they did with the Japanese Americans, right? But I think what you say, Dr. Ina, is perfect. It's that when people actually know what's going on, when they get a hold of the facts, when they hear people's stories, when they understand the violence, when they understand the inhumanity that is perpetrated against innocent people and people whose human rights are being violated in the face of so much you know, conflict and poverty and criminalization, you know, they see right through these very thin arguments, these arguments that uphold stereotypes and perpetuate, you know, very like violent and inaccurate notions of otherness. And so that's why the storytelling is so important. But let's move on to the question by Lucero, because Kyle told me that his question's a little off the topic of incarceration. So why don't you ask your question, unless you want someone else to read it, but I'll let you ask it if you want to first.
I can read it. Well, so earlier you mentioned you supported the abolition of prisons, right? Well, do you think like abolishing prisons entirely should be the first step, or do you think there's like a step needed beforehand, like, you know, what's going on right now with defunding the police? Do you think defunding the police is needed in order to go to adapt the full system that's abolishing the prison industrial complex? The reason I ask is because like whenever, you know, I have discussions about abolishing prisons, people always say that like, no, we need prisons. Where are we gonna put the bad people? So I just wanted to know like your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lucero. I think it's going to be, you know, a process. It's not going to happen overnight, and it needs to be stepped. And I think Ennis made a good point about how these kind of changes need to happen so that everything isn't completely disrupted. But some disruption is going to be essential. You know, and I think defunding police is a good start with the ultimate goal of shifting from this punishment perspective to healing and problem solving the things that cause the problems, and working to many victims. You know, when you look at the statistics, many people who are in prison for crimes committed were also victims themselves. And so it's this recycling that's going on over and over again. So in the end, I think that would be an end goal. I think there are steps. I think we need really creative thinking, like I think some kind of brain trust that would gather all the experts together, social justice experts together, to think through what kind of community programs, what are ways that we could really get to the heart of what is causing, like we know that poverty, people get imprisoned for poverty-related circumstances. You know, they can't pay the ticket, they can't make their rent, but they get imprisoned, fined. They can't make bail. All of these ways that this circular repetition of punishment. So we need community programs, community-based. Like I think when I think about the whole asylum-seeking detention program, instead of putting people in prison, if we had, and you think about people have to hide in churches because they're trying to save their lives. You know, this is insane. So, you know, we need to have community programs that help people build their lives again, to strengthen and give them opportunities so they're not struggling with poverty. So it's going to require lots stratified changes all across the board. In the end, there are communities historically that have lived and survived without prisons. But we have to get to the heart of the problem. Why do we have so many drug-related crimes? You know, those are the kinds of questions that people need to think about. And then what is the treatment, not just of the individual, but of the society, of the community? It needs to be a broader-based approach. I wish I had all the answers, but I'm sure there are many more brilliant people who have you know, creative new ways of addressing the problems. And I think we have to, as soon as possible, center the victims rather than the perpetrators in terms of where we put our resources.
I would just add as well that a lot of these movements are actually happening right now. I mean, there are people who are creating autonomous zones, right? And they're not relying on law enforcement to solve issues in their communities. And then there's also the sanctuary movement, which I think if you think about it in an expanded sense, can actually be a great model because all of us need protection, right? All of us are vulnerable, right? But for different reasons, and we all live in different circumstances. And so, you know, there are sanctuary hospitals, sanctuary labor unions, sanctuary cities and churches, states. So I think some of these infrastructures are being created, and there's an amazing anthropologist, Miriam Tickton, who writes a lot about this, specifically the connection between sanctuary and women's rights struggles. But I think, and even as we've seen during COVID, there are cities mobilizing transnationally, right? When the federal government or when nation states are not doing enough to protect their own citizens. So I think there are new forms that are you know, being created. And I also think we have to move away from the nation state form, right? And so I'm really excited to see, you know, cities working together across oceans, across borders, and rural areas doing similar things, but all from like a grassroots sort of mobilization, right? So we just have to open up our eyes and to amplify the voices and the movements that are already taking place all around us. You know, so it's an exciting time too. I mean, as Arundhati Roy tells us, the pandemic is a portal. This is the time for radical solutions, for creative thinking, for creating a new world. But I'm going to get off because this is such an exciting topic for me, but I'm going to shut up now. So, because Kyle has a question. So go ahead, Kyle.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Dr. Ina. It's truly a privilege to speak with you, and thank you for joining. So my question, the reason why I asked to go a little later is because it not necessarily connected to, a domestic issue in the U.S., but for my work, a little background, I do investigative journalism, as a long-term career, and my first project is centered around the Uyghur people of Xinjiang. one of the reasons I was so excited to jump on this call and ask a question is because after watching your documentaries, I really admired the way how, because I was watching these films and, so drawn into the narrative and into the storytelling and I didn't really understand in the moment how much real information I was absorbing regarding just raw information on U.S. policy towards historical policy, things like the psychology of victims of these sorts of government sanctioned programs. And I find myself, so I've been collecting testimony for with several political refugees that I found from Xinjiang, and these are people that have experienced family separation, have experienced incredibly direct police oppression, state oppression, mass indiscriminate incarceration, and as a result, a lot of the survivors that I've been speaking with are, even aside from the pressure and the fear that they have to even speak to a journalist or somebody who is keeping a record of what's happened to them, they have a great there's a you see this great psychological toll that it's taken on them of having their life and their family completely uprooted. And one thing that I've been working on this for a year now, and I just have so much information and so many angles and so many things that I feel like the world needs to know about, but from the media accounts that I've seen being published on this topic, and it really just I think reflects the state of media in the United States in contemporary time, is the lack of some sort of of a humanizing storytelling angle of capturing the humanity, just not labeling them as Muslim minorities, but rather as people who have thousands of years of unique history that's being systematically destroyed. And I was wondering if you have any advice, as a film director, as an author, as a psychotherapist, and to what elements of this trauma, what elements of these testimonies to really bring out to show people and what is happening. And this of course could be extended to because I'm publishing in US outlets, and of course this extends to everything we've been speaking about regarding police abolition and mass incarceration in the States. So what elements from these experiences of victims would you say are the most powerful and important to tell in a compelling way?
It's terrific questioning that you're doing and great work that you're doing, Kyle. For me, I think the most powerful messaging comes from first-person personal narratives, and asking the right questions that have to do with the psychology of oppression, the psychology of the trauma. Like, how has this experience, so like one of the questions I ask my patients too is, I said, at what moment, so there's several questions, but at what moment did you decide you were going to survive this? What, and so, like prisoners of conscience, for example, they have strategies and plans, and they know, if you're being tortured, here are ways to survive that torture. But the masses of people who are being perpetrated against, there is, for many, not everybody, this kind of internal wisdom about their right to be, to exist, asking the question that goes to the heart of that, I feel like has made a big difference. It's what we do in our healing circles. We ask people, what is, you have have a short amount of time in this circle with people who want to hear what it is about you that helped you to survive. What is it? And it could be anything, but this is what people really resonate to. This is the answer they want to hear from everybody. Like, what does it take to believe that you have a right to be who you are? And when people tell that story, when they talk about the pain that they felt when they had to leave their dog behind, and that when they asked their neighbors if they would take care of the dog, and the neighbors said, no, they won't take a Jap dog. What happened after that? What did you do to survive that pain? You know, and those answers have been pretty amazing, pretty remarkable. And that's the core of the humanity that we want to reach when we're making these dramatic social changes. Yeah, that I believe there is this intrinsic goodness in everybody, and that we reach for that when we're faced with our elimination. You know, what do we believe about ourselves that keep us Muslim, that keep us proud of being Japanese, that keep us believing that Black Lives Matter? There's something there that when you reach deep into that stories come out that can be very, very healing. And people looking for healing right now. Yeah, I hope I answered, Kyle, because it's a question we could talk about that forever.
Yes, well, it's after a year, it seems like it is going to be forever. So thank you, I appreciate that. Is, you know, and it's hard for that, you know, those first person accounts coming out, that because a lot of these the survivors I've spoken to are so terrified of reprisal from the state when they speak, you know, tell their stories. I have to meet them secretly. I have to, you know, they wear sunglasses. It's all very discreet, and you know, but yeah, I found, you know, those moments they're revealing. I think everybody kind of wants to know what they would do in those moments, and you know, so I appreciate that. Thank you. That helps.
But see, what you're doing is asking them to be vulnerable when they're really not safe. So I think it's this contradiction. As a journalist, you're wanting to reach in deep and then make public, and that puts them in jeopardy. So I can see how it's the tension there.
Yeah, and it's a lot of negotiation, and and the cybersecurity alone is, you know, costed a lot of money, and you know, so but there is that belief. I think that even speaking to, because I was surprised that they started speaking to a lot of my the victims spoke to me, because you know, they see the extermination of their entire existence. And you know, it's really kind of heroic. So
yeah,
well, thank you.
Thank you for your work. It's really important.
Of course. Thank you for yours.
For both of yours. I'll just jump in. Kyle, if you don't mind, would you mind maybe sending anyone who wants to keep in contact with you about your work as it progresses into the future, your email or some way to contact you? I know there are some people on this call who have asked me if there's some way they can reach out to you and just talk more with you or think with you as you complete this project. It sounds amazing, and I'd love to stay in touch as well.
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure. I'll send you the link, or I'll send an email, phone number, my address. You guys can come over.
Have a beer.
Socially distanced though. Socially distanced though. Oh no. Of course.
I think. Are there any other questions first? I don't want to end.
I just want to briefly ask. I've been trying to access the movie, and then they came for us, but I don't think it's anyway streamable online. One has to purchase.
Yeah, It's not streaming online yet, but you can contact her. I can put it in the chat, Abby Ginsburg's contact information, because then she could, I know that she has copies that she sends to people, but she also has a distributor that she can direct you to.
But only physical copies. Is that correct?
Yeah, right. It's not. I think next year it'll be available. She's still screening it everywhere, so it's not. Yeah.
I think we have another question from Julia Evans Asano. It's a great, relevant question about an incident, or series of incidents, I should say, that have been happening at Syracuse University. So Julia, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, I'm a rising junior undergrad at Syracuse University, and I lived in the residence hall where the racist graffiti was occurring in multiple floors of my building, and my floor in particular was the one that targeted Asian students, because my floor was majority international Chinese students. And I'm also half Japanese myself, so it was something that also impacted me, because I immigrated to America, so I know what it's like for my international students to feel like wanting to be integrating to American culture, but not quite being accepted when they first get here. And so I saw that during the movement, it triggered a hashtag and like a social movement on campus called Not Again SU. And it was because there have been racist incidents occurring throughout generations at SU, and so the students finally had enough, which is why it's called Not Again SU. And so during that movement, mostly it was other BIPOCs that went to the protest and spoke out and created platforms for them to speak in a safe space, as well as the international Asian community that did so. But the Asian American community was very invisible during that time, and a lot of them tended to give excuses like they couldn't afford to have their grades drop since it was towards final season. And also others said that they didn't feel comfortable going to those spaces because they didn't feel like they belonged in the movement, because because of like not only the model minority identity they had, but also just in general, they felt like that movement wasn't for them. And so I was wondering why it was for Asian Americans to feel like it's harder to be active in these kinds of social movements.
Well, you cut out at the end. Why that what?
Why the Asian American community, especially Asian American youth, tends to find it harder for them to be actively on these social movements.
I don't know. I'm wondering where they're from. Like, you know, being in California, it's like the youth Asian Americans have been so active and so informed and so ready to be in solidarity with other communities. But you know, I think it may be unique to Syracuse University that it is a you know, a very elite school, and people who go there may have more investment in maintaining their status and you know, within their community, within their family, and maybe so this invisibility of Asian Americans isn't something new. It's not unique to SU, but it is something that the young people that I've been working with on the West Coast have been very anxious to break out of. So I don't know that I have an answer. Do you have a theory about that yourself?
I mean, from my experiences, especially on SU, we do have like diversity in terms of quota, but we're not very integrated as a campus. Yeah. And so you can see within the community, things are separated based on like your identity. And so the Asian Americans tend to stick together, and then the international Asians tend to stick together. And then there's like the Black community, and then the Latinx Latino community. the Latinx Hispanic community, and then the white community as well. They're all very separated and they don't tend to integrate, which has been an issue that we've been trying to address for the past couple of years. But I feel like, I mean, the community I'm in, we've been trying to re-educate one another to try and enforce like integration in a way where we try to learn more about other people, other communities, and try to support them as much as we can. But also it's hard when we don't get that reciprocated back to us. So I feel like that may be part of the reason, but I think more in general, we just feel like it's, I feel like most of the Asian Americans feel like it's harder to join because they don't know where their place is within this movement.
Mm-hmm. And I think about, you know, Asian Americans who have succeeded in terms of moving into middle class status generally. The risk of losing their standing or the pressure from their parents and their identification with whiteness keeps them, you know, safer and more comfortable in their own circle, and not to be identified with communities that are you know, disrupting the myths of who they are. And I think, you know, it's like, I think the people who are experiencing more direct oppression are more likely to identify with protest as a recourse. And the communities that are in the middle where they're comfortable enough and the commitment to just status quo are less likely to engage in anything that looks like protest. You know, Japanese Americans on the West Coast have a long history of protest. But they've protested on the shoulders of the Black human rights and civil rights leaders. And if you don't have that kind of influence that says it's worth the risk to join in solidarity with other communities, I think the people in the middle who feel like, well, this is good enough, are less likely to want to step outside of that security net. So when I think what your goal of getting the groups to talk together more, like healing circles would be great for those, you know, have some from every community sit together and share their personal stories, working towards, and then we found that rather than just teaching classes on ethnic studies, that when you do these personal experiences where people feel safe enough to be vulnerable and share their family stories, it's powerful. Yeah, I don't have an exact answer for you, Julia, but I'm glad you're working towards, because the way it is now, it's the fractioning of our communities. You know, racism fractures us internally, but also fractures us in terms of our own Asian American community. So, you know, who's a more recent immigrant and who's been here longer, those things are false narratives about what we have in common and our investment in social change. So carry on.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Julia. And I guess I would just say that right now, what we really need to be focusing on is foregrounding our similarities and finding ways to build solidarity, right? I know it's tough, but I think there's a lot more that people have in common than things that they don't. And it's okay to recognize that people are disproportionately and unequally affected by different systems of oppression, but that everybody in the end is vulnerable. Like I said before, everybody needs protection, everyone needs safety. And so we shouldn't like give up any of that territory to the other side when in fact we have so much that we can start from, right? And instead of starting from our differences, you know, starting from a place that it's a bit more optimistic about the future and about our relationships with each other and about overlapping struggles and histories. And we know that for so many years, for so many decades, activists have worked across borders. And I don't mean just national borders, but I mean identity borders, you know, to support one another and to provide aid and mutual support. And so I hope that that's able to come to fruition at a micro level on the campus of Syracuse, but I think it's happening around the country and around the world as well in small but very fruitful ways. So it is 8:29, and there's so much more that I wanted to get to, but at this point, I think we have to end because I don't want to take up too much of Dr. Ina's time. But I will ask Dr. Ina, is it okay if you share your contact information with anyone who wants to stay in contact with you?
Yes.
And then I guess we will close it out from there. So thank you to everyone who joined us for our discussion. I think it was a very, very deep and interesting and provocative discussion. And I'm sure all of you are doing amazing things beyond Zoom. So I can't wait to hear about all of that, and feel free to stay in touch with me as well. So have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Good luck to all of you. Be safe.
Bye.
Thank you.
You as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ina.
Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you.